on the same amount of feed, these chicks were getting bigger. And colleagues of his soon confirmed this same effect in all kinds of animals: goats, pigs, ducks, mules, cows. Cows would give more milk. Pigs would have bigger litters, all in the same amount of feed. And if you consider that feed is the most expensive part of raising livestock, this felt a lot like free meat. And keep in mind, this is post-World War II. There's a lot of food shortages around the world, and even in the United States, meat was short, prices were high. And so Jukes' discovery had the feeling of a miracle. And in fact, the practice of administering what we call sub-therapeutic antibiotics to animals became central to what became the livestock revolution, which is a fancy way of saying an explosive growth in the amount of meat that we could produce. You know, over the next few decades, we figured out how to produce a heck of a lot of meat for much lower prices. And we changed the global diet. Cheap meat meant that populations that previously could not afford meat never ate it, or ate it, once a year, now had access to meat, had access to protein, and it changed their bodies. They grew. They developed faster. They became healthier. Disease began to come down. We fundamentally changed the shape of the human race. And, there's no doubt this was miraculous, given the state we were in. And Thomas Jukes was celebrated as something of an industrial strength hero. And it would be several decades before we'd realize that there are some downsides to feeding animals with antibiotics. I mean, most obviously, the livestock industry today is addicted to antibiotics. More than half of all antibiotics produced today are fed to our animals. Think about that next time you go shopping for meat. The more sort of insidious problem is that if you feed animals sub-therapeutic doses of antibiotics, what happens to the germs? You don't kill all the germs, it turns out. You only kill the weak ones. The strong ones survive, they reproduce, and what you end up doing is creating these subpopulations of superbugs who are immune to that antibiotic. Which means that if that superbug jumps from the population of animals into, say, the human population and causes an infection, you can't use that antibiotic to fight it. And over the course of several decades, what we've done is we have neutralized some of our best antibiotics. We've made them ineffective against these superbugs. And a lot of people in the medical community look at this trend and they say, what if we're approaching a time when we don't have antibiotics or don't have recourse to antibiotics as easily as we do today? Such that if you had an infection, if your child had an earache or worse, and you went down to the clinic, there wasn't anything they could do. This is how it used to be before the Industrial Revolution gave us antibiotics. What if we were slipping back into a period like that? All because Thomas Jukes. Now, Thomas Jukes, rest assured, did not think he was destroying the world. I mean, that wasn't his idea. He felt he was saving the world. But Thomas Jukes came from a generation of scientists and from an era of scientific thinking where the way you saved the world, and certainly the way you understood the world, was you pulled it apart. You took apart the world and you studied its individual parts and you improved them individually and you reassembled them, ideally in a sort of a more efficient configuration. This is what we call industrialization. And we've done this with most of the rest of the world. We've done it with manufacturing, we've done it with our banking, and now we're going to do it with food. And consider what we did. We took sort of the traditional model of food production, which was sort of self-contained. I mean, most farmers produced pretty much everything they needed. They did grain, they had livestock, they fed the grain to the livestock. They did vegetables, fruit. They did most of their processing, that is their canning and putting up on site. And they consumed a lot of what they produced. They might have traded it locally, but essentially it was sort of the great circle of life right there on the farm. Well, the experts looked at this and they said, that's nice, but it's not very efficient. We could be producing a lot more food if we stopped trying to duplicate this farming function on 10 million farms, on 100 million farms. Instead, let's have fewer, bigger farms. And let's not try to produce everything on site. Let's do the grain where it makes sense in the Midwest, and let's do livestock where it makes sense. And we can just ship the grain to where the livestock is. And we can produce vegetables out in California. We can produce apples up in Washington State, which is where I'm from. And we'll just ship them back and forth. And meanwhile, on the farm, since we have all this great machinery, we don't need as many people farming. So we'll ship them to the cities, and where they can get jobs in factories and offices. And it's true that they'll not have time to cook, and they certainly won't have time or space to farm, and they'll probably have forgotten how. But that's okay because we've got these great factories where we're going to be producing their meals for them. And stepping back, this system is very efficient and cheap. I mean, do you realize what we've done to food prices through this time? You know, in 1900, the average US family spent half of their household income on food. 50 cents of every dollar was spent just keeping yourself fed. Today, it's less than a dime, around 9 cents, depending on where you live. And if you consider what that means, since you're not having to spend half of your money on food, you could spend it on health care. You could spend it on college education for your kids, on a nicer house, a bigger car, a vacation. Your standard of living would go up, in large part because you would industrialize the food system, or that's certainly one of the factors. And no wonder we thought our modern food system was a miracle, because it had changed not just the way we ate, but pretty much everything else. Housewives didn't have to spend hours and hours. It used to take an average of 4 hours a day to process, prepare, cook, and clean up the food. How much time do you all spend on food? Or how much do you imagine spending when you get out of school? I mean, the average time, it's getting close to a half an hour a day. So there are substantial benefits. But in the process, we've seen that there are also costs. There are costs. Food, it turns out, doesn't like to be treated like an industrial product. It rebels. It pushes back. Let me give you an example. I mean, if we wanted to make cell phones the most efficient way possible, what would we do? Well, we'd get a huge plant, a huge factory. Why? Because if you produce in volume, the more units you produce, the lower the cost per unit. It's classic economics, and it applies. And what else would you want to do? Well, you'd want to get your parts as cheaply as possible from wherever you could, just as long as they were cheap. And you'd want to be able to, inside the plant, you'd want to be able to move your production lines back and forth and adjust your flows as necessary to meet the market. And lastly, your distribution system. Once you'd finished building those phones, you'd want to be able to ship them to the customer overnight. Okay, if we're talking about cell phones or computers or television sets, that's great. But what if we're talking about food? Let's consider food that's been industrialized, hamburger. Today, hamburger is made very much the same way in huge factories. You know, most hamburger is made from spent dairy cows. A spent dairy cow is a cow that's done its work. It's now getting ready for retirement. The problem is that a dairy cow is very lean, so it has to be, and Americans like juicy hamburgers, so the meat has to be juiced up. I'm sorry if anyone had a burger tonight. We're going to be spending a little time with this, so just bear with me. So these plants get their supply of meat from feedlots, and not just 1 or 2 feedlots. Because they're always looking for the best deal, they're getting them from whatever feedlots they can. So now if you go into the store and look at a package of hamburger, it will say product of US, Canada, maybe Mexico, maybe Australia. And they've done tests on individual patties and looked, based on DNA, how many different cows are represented in that patty. And the average is something like 40, but they found patties with the meat from more than 1,000 cows in one patty. I mean, I wonder if that tastes any different. And they mix this hamburger that comes in. It's like a massive web of beef parts flowing in toward these factories. And it's mixed together in these batches. And we're talking massive batches, multi-ton batches, which are mixed together and shipped off to other plants, which then mix them into products like pizza topping or hamburger patties. And then they're put into the final product, and they're packaged, and they're shipped to you very quickly. Now, this system is a marvel when it works. It gets food to the people very quickly, and it does so very cheaply. But what happens when there's a mistake? When an error is committed? That error also gets to the people very quickly. So how many people here have heard of Tops Meat? Well, I'm going to tell you about it. Tops Meat is one of the biggest, in fact, the biggest maker of frozen hamburger patties in the country and probably in the world, and presumably knew a thing or two about food safety. And yet, Tops Meat, because it hired people, humans, and humans make errors, it committed an error. And because it was producing on such a massive scale, that error was magnified. And the error was this: they mixed 2 batches of hamburger. You're not supposed to do that. They mixed one day's batch with another. And one of those batches happened to contain E. coli. So the tainted meat was then processed into hamburger patties, many hamburger patties, and shipped. And was already in homes, stores and homes, before they realized there'd been a problem. So what could they do? Well, they recalled all their meat, 23 million pounds, which works out to be about 100 million patties. They recalled that. And it was so big and so expensive, the company went out of business. Now think about this. As a business model, forget environmentalism, forget health, just as a business model. Here's how this works. Your company is so big and works so quickly and is so vulnerable that mistakes are inevitable because you still hire human beings. And once a mistake has been committed, that mistake will disappear, will leave the system before you are even aware of it, and your only recourse is to go out of business. Does that make sense as a business model? And yet that is pretty much how a lot of food is made in this country and increasingly in the rest of the world. So what are the lessons here? Well, never eat hamburger again. No, I'm not saying that. But one of the things we're recognizing that food resists being industrialized, and two, that we're still dealing with a food system. I mean, the scientists back in Thomas Jukes' day, they sort of thought they were taking apart the old antiquated system and replacing it with a very precise industrial system, a system that could be fine-tuned and adjusted, and that there would be no errors. If there were errors, we could just turn the dials and change things. And it turns out that we did replace that old system with a new system, but that new system is just as prone to error, and it is just as prone to sort of the echo effect, where a mistake that occurs in one area will pop up somewhere else. And what this makes us realize is that many of the problems that we're dealing with today in the food system are problems that actually began as solutions. They actually began as someone's attempt, well-intended, poorly considered attempt to fix some problem, but to fix it without regard for where that problem sat in the rest of the system, to imagine that you could fix it separately. Thomas Jukes, he just looked at the animals. In fact, he just looked at a part of the animal. He didn't think about how changing something going on in the gut would change the rest of the animal, would affect the way that animal related to the system. And we make those mistakes all the time. We try to fix things in a singular way. We try to isolate problems without regard to the way those problems sort of exist in the rest of the system. And what we're realizing is that until we sort of get our heads around this system idea, we're not going to be able to really solve our problems. And worse, our solutions will just end up being problems that our children and grandchildren have to fix. So part of what we're trying to do here is understand this sort of system way of thinking. Now, one of the sort of dismaying aspects of this system echo effect is that many times the catalyst, the thing that sets it in motion, isn't some noble effort to save humanity. I mean, Thomas Jukes really did think he was saving humanity. Oftentimes, it's just a business decision. It's a company responding to a changing marketplace. Now, we want companies to respond to changing marketplaces. This is what keeps us all employed. It's what keeps the capitalist system going. The problem is that when we make those changes without regard for the effects that they will have on a larger system, we can sometimes end up with more problems than we're solving. Good case in point, McDonald's. I'm sure some of you have heard of this chain. Back in the late 70s, McDonald's had a meat problem. Beef was suddenly out of fashion. Why? Well, it was expensive, but it had also been sort of identified by the medical community as the cause of heart attacks. So suddenly meat's unpopular, and sales are going down, which for a company like McDonald's is bad news, because what else do they sell? So they need a new meat fast. All right, so what do they choose? Yes, absolutely. Why did they choose it? 3 reasons. 1, it was ostensibly healthier than beef. Of course, McDonald's would fix that. 2, it was ethnically neutral, meaning it offended the fewest groups around the world, which was critical because McDonald's at that point was seriously considering moving the Golden Arches, making it global. And 3, it was more amenable, chicken is more amenable to some of the new processing technologies that were then becoming fashionable, particularly with something called mechanical separation. Now, for the few of you who don't know what that is, I'll describe it. Essentially, where you take an animal, you want to separate the meat from the bones. And if there are any chickens in the audience, I apologize in advance, you essentially shove the animal through a sieve. The bones stay on this side, the animal's on this side, but it's no longer in the same form. In fact, it's a slurry. This is the industry term. And to this slurry, you add things. You add salt, you add flavorings. McDonald's added beef flavoring, which is great. You add fixatives and emulsifiers to thicken it, and you end up with this paste that you can form into things. And of course, you can make all sorts of shapes. You can make patties, you can make franks, and you can make nuggets. Yes, that's what you were going to say. And McDonald's said, what we'll do is we will form these nuggets. They call them finger size. For some reason, they thought that was sort of an attractive marketing term. I love that, a finger size, you know. When I was a kid, I was told to keep my fingers away. Anyway,